Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. We're just going to give everyone maybe another 45 seconds to a minute to get into the room, and then we'll get started. Okay, thank you so much for joining us today for Leveraging AI in Salesforce and Beyond. We will be recording the presentation. We'll send a copy of the deck, the recording itself, and a special AI resources PDF to everyone here by email later this week. And just a little housekeeping, please feel free to, at any point throughout the presentation, add questions to the Q&A panel at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar, and we have carved out time at the end for questions. Well, I would like to introduce Fíonta, and then we'll move right into introducing our presenter, and then, of course, the presentation itself. Fíonta is a Salesforce implementation partner. We were founded in 2001 in Washington, D.C., and we've had the privilege of serving the technology needs of over 1,200 associations and nonprofits since then. Our fully remote staff now numbers 75 plus across the United States, and we are proudly women-owned, led, and our delivery services team is 2/3 women. We are a values-driven company. They underpin everything we do, both internally and externally. And so partnering with Fíonta means you have access not only to a partner for life, but to our broad team of Salesforce experts and strategic partners. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter today, Arden Winner. Arden is a senior Salesforce consultant here at Fíonta, working to support our managed services practice called Accent. Arden has specific interest in AI and has led internal AI initiatives, as well as working with clients as we all enter this new world together. In addition to Arden's certifications, she's a native Marylander, a cat mom, and her favorite quote is "practice reckless optimism." And now I will step back, hand you over to Arden to get started. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. So we'll be going through a pretty broad suite of AI topics, a little level set of what we're talking about here in these contexts when we discuss artificial intelligence. We'll spend some time talking about not only some Salesforce-specific features for AI, but how, if you're not a Salesforce customer, you can extend some of the practices of some of these tools into your own CRM. We'll talk about large language models like ChatGPT, how to best select tools that are most effective for you and your association, as well as best practices for using tools like co-pilots and other large language models to best serve yourselves and your members. And then we'll talk a little bit about some ethical considerations of AI implementation and some ways that we can avoid and mitigate some of those ethical concerns. Then we'll move into Q&A at the end. So I wanted to give this brief level set of what is artificial intelligence, because this term gets bandied about a lot. And I think sometimes people have differing expectations of what artificial intelligence tools are built to do and what they can do for you. Very broadly, artificial intelligence is the practice of trying to make machines that think like humans. And when a lot of us first hear this term, we think of things like iRobot and like Her, these movies that have broad sweeping artificial intelligence devices that can make complicated ethical or moral decisions with rationale and more measured intelligence behind them. This is what in the industry we would refer to as strong artificial intelligence. This is something that you would actually qualify as thinking like a person and making rational decisions based on large suites of data. What we talk about nowadays in the real world of tech that we can implement is called weak AI. And these are tools that can look at very large data sets and review larger pieces of information than humans can process and make recommendations, analysis, or generations based on that data. We classify these further into predictive tools, which are things like analytics and modeling. We can look at all of your members and do some best guess analysis based on some criteria of what of these members are the most likely to renew on an individual basis. Or we can have generative AI, which is something like ChatGPT. I can put in plain text input and it will produce for me plain language output. And we also see generative tools that can create images. Like I want to create promotional materials for my upcoming annual conference, and I could create those images rather than going to a stock image library by generating them net new using an artificial intelligence tool. So it's important to understand that people talk about an AI tool or an AI model as learning information and just being able to aggregate and understand things. But I think it's important to realize that AI models don't learn or know things. They are constantly training themselves on aggregated data sets and making the most likely prediction or the most likely generation based on that data. At no point does your AI model understand or know things that are being fed to it. It just has the ability to continually review and analyze that data. The reason I want to start with this brief level set is so that as we're talking about some of these tools, we understand that these are simply tools in our arsenal to better use the data that we have about our members and to better interact with and serve them. This is not a candidate that you can hire to do a job. This is a tool in your tech stack that you can use to, again, better serve your members and better work in your industry. So the next thing we're going to talk about are some of these initially Salesforce specific tools. And if you're not familiar with Salesforce, this is Astro. This is Salesforce's mascot guide that walks us through some trails and educational content with Salesforce. I thought they were a fun companion to this portion of our presentation. But some of these tools, although they are Salesforce specific, I think the way that Salesforce is encouraging us to model and analyze our data is helpful in other CRMs outside of Salesforce. So currently, Salesforce offers both predictive and generative tools. So that means that we have access to both analysis and modeling of the data that's already directly living inside of our CRM, and also generating usually text-based content for us, as well as some flow automation that we'll talk about in a little bit. Again, all directly integrated within our CRM. And much like other Salesforce tools that are available to administrators, these are things that allow us for easy automation that doesn't require development. So without writing custom code, we have these ways to use some visual tools to analyze and transform our data. A lot of these Salesforce offerings in the AI space, much like every company in the AI space, as it's quite new generally, are still in development. So there's always change and flux of what is available, what resources are available based on certain types of Salesforce licensing. So this is a space of great change in Salesforce and in the industry at large. And like I've said, for those that are not Salesforce customers, there are still plenty of tools available for you. Although your CRM of choice might not offer point and click automation or point and click predictive analysis like Salesforce does, the mindset of these tools, I think, would be helpful as you go and look for things that can help you with these predictive analytics, with these chatbot offerings and things like that we're going to talk about with Salesforce. So Salesforce has integrated AI offerings broadly across its ecosystem. If you're not familiar with Salesforce, we describe these different areas as clouds for sales, so for prospective marketing to new members, as well as some of the marketing automation that Salesforce offers, service for offering cases for membership renewal or access to member benefits, as well as looking at some of our analytics, and then some deeper pieces in Salesforce's data cloud that would allow us to do real-time transformation and analysis based on some of these AI predictive modeling tools. Across the Salesforce ecosystem, a lot of these tools are called Einstein. So we might have Einstein Studio, Einstein Prediction Builder, Einstein Chatbots. So oftentimes for the majority of Salesforce tools, if you see Einstein, there's going to be some aspect of artificial intelligence built into that tool. So the largest piece that we're going to talk about here is predictive analytics. And this allows us in Salesforce to turn our existing data into predictions of future outcomes using a tool called Einstein Studio's Prediction Builder. Now, it's really important to evaluate before we implement predictive analytics in Salesforce or outside, the quality of our underlying data and the strength of our use case. Because if our data is not refreshed, right, if we haven't contacted our members to ask them to report their revenue and their employee count and other demographic pieces about their company, it might be difficult for us to reliably analyze any of those attributes and figure out which of these members is most likely to renew, especially if we think that those criteria are really key factors in renewal possibility. So before we go into implementing something like predictive analytics, this is a really good time to evaluate a member census, to send out this survey to ask our members to update their data. It could also be a good time to make sure that we've done a thorough analysis of duplicates in our system to make sure that we have one record per member company and we have one record per member constituent, and to make sure that all of the attributes that we're looking at in our CRM or in our AMS are things that we think are valuable. Because if we have multiple fields that we're using to capture the same piece of data, or if we have fields that we try to predict on that aren't well maintained or aren't well updated, the value of those predictive analytics is going to go down as our data gets more and more cluttered. So this is a great time to take a pause before we go into some of these larger analytics to make sure that we've got the house in order from a data perspective. The other piece is about strength of use case. I think a lot of folks hear about AI and they're excited about all of the things that it can offer, and they just want to throw this tool at their problems to make sure that they can try everything to try and solve things about member retention and member growth. But these tools are only as useful as the problem that we apply them for and the way that we implement them. So if I want to look at membership retention, I might have a use case for looking at all of my members and trying to do some calculations about whether or not they're going to renew. But looking at all of my members in a particular county in a particular state, that might not be the best use of my time in terms of implementing some of these predictive analytics. So it's important to make sure that we understand what the question is that we're trying to ask, that we're trying to use these predictive analytics tools to solve, and that we understand all of the data that we're looking at is going to be valuable. We really want to focus with all of these types of AI implementation, but especially I think with some of these analytics, on requirements that we can actually use and act upon to make effective change in our association. If I run membership retention analytics and I identify based on percentages the likelihood that each of my members is going to renew, and I put a lot of time and staff effort into making sure that I can run those analytics, but then I don't actually have any plan to use that data to effectively market to my members that I think I can convince to renew based on my analysis, that time that I put in was not necessarily well spent, as opposed to if I have that effective requirement that I've developed my analytics for and a plan to use them, that means that this implementation of AI was effective and something that I'm actually going to carry forward for my association. Now, like I said, your data quality is really key when you're looking at these predictive analytics, because say I think that the larger a member company is, the more likely they are to renew, right? And I look at that largeness of my company based on both revenue and employee size. But if I haven't updated that information, either by looking at SEC filings or by doing that sort of member census effort, I might run analytics and get an output because I have data in those fields, but it's not refreshed and it's not actually accurately representing whether or not my members are likely to renew. If you are a developer or you've spent a lot of time talking to developers or programmers, you've probably heard the term garbage in, garbage out. And that is especially true of AI tools, because unless you take some time to implement some manual intercession in your process, like we'll discuss a little bit later, the AI is not going to factor out outlier records, duplicate records, or junk records. It's just going to look at everything you feed it and model off of everything that you input. So all of these models are assuming that any data that you input and any attributes that you want to calculate against are accurate. So we really want to make sure, because the AI tool that we're using can't make those decisions for us, that we implement those decisions by deciding what data we're going to feed into our model to analyze against. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of these other Salesforce offerings before going into a little bit more of a detailed demo about how this Einstein prediction builder works and how we can build it out. So one option that's made available is Einstein chatbots. So this is something that your staff can implement in either your member portal in Salesforce, or if you have an external website that you've implemented and tied into your Salesforce instance. And this allows for members, for potential members, or just for folks who are interested in the work that your association does, to have a self-service experience online without having to directly talk to an agent or somebody who's on your team. Now, these are really easily configurable. And we can build these tools in Salesforce to do lots of different things, to go through all sorts of different dialogue options for, say, a member who's looking to join. We can collect some information via that chatbot about the area that they're located, their industry, and their size. to then, for example, direct them to the correct membership application for the member type for which they're the best suited. Now, these are really easy to set up, but I would imagine that everyone in this room has had at this point at least one bad experience with a self-service chatbot on a website for a service that you might have wanted to use. Say there's a new tool that you're looking to pick up in your tech stack. You've tried to go and get information on their website, and you found yourself being poorly served by the chatbot that's made available to you there. When we're thinking about some of these exciting tools, especially things that are more member-facing, we want to keep in mind that our member experience is still paramount with everything that we want to implement. A poorly implemented chatbot that is a frustrating experience for potential members or existing members is worse than no chatbot at all. So I think it's important to understand that this is something that we'll want to thoroughly test out all of the different paths that our external users can walk down as they interact with this chatbot to make sure that it's not something that's going to prove to be more frustrating for them than just navigating the website on their own. Another tool that's available via Einstein is something that I think is really helpful for a lot of small teams at associations, and that's Einstein for Flow. Now, again, if you're not a Salesforce customer, Flow is a really powerful tool that's made available for Salesforce to do non-code-based automation, where we can use visual elements and combine them together to build automation based on certain criteria. And this is one of the greatest and the most challenging tools in Salesforce, especially for new admins. I know a lot of folks at associations on the admin side, especially if you're migrating from a legacy AMS or CRM platform into Salesforce, are having to learn what they do on the job. And it can be really challenging to skill up in things like Flow when you're having to learn everything as those new use cases come to you. Now, what Einstein for Flow does is allows us to use plain text input. I can ask Einstein to say, create a flow to send emails after a membership sales order is created to make sure that I've sent them all of their onboarding materials. Then once those onboarding materials have been received, I want to create a membership for that company and then send them out, some committee application forms. And I can use that plain text. Then Salesforce and Einstein in the background are going to generate for me a flow that it thinks is going to do all of those things for me. So this is a really valuable tool to help someone who has some familiarity with Flow do things that are a little outside of their skill set or solve problems that they haven't been able to solve before. This is not something that I would recommend necessarily for an admin or a new Salesforce user who has no experience with Flow, because as we'll talk about a little bit as we go through, AI tools are not always the greatest way to learn new skills that you've never had before or that you have no experience with, because you might have no way to validate the information that's being provided to you or to make sure that my flow does everything that I want it to and it doesn't do things that I don't want it to do. But for those admins who have gone through and done some of that self-guided learning as they've grown in their Salesforce journey and who need something to help take them up to that next level, or to make sure that they can serve multiple teams at their association with more complex automation requirements than they might be familiar with, this AI in Flow is a really helpful tool to, again, get you to that next level of automation and something that you can service in-house as you gain more knowledge. So the next thing we're going to talk about in more detail is this Einstein Studio Prediction Builder. Now, this is a really helpful tool that Salesforce has made available for free as kind of a test pilot for a lot of existing customers. And there is a small set that you can configure for free, and then you can have one or two of them active at a time to be running some of these analytics. Because you have this limited set of free predictions available through Salesforce, it's recommended that when we're thinking about what use cases we want to solve, we're as broad as possible. So I wouldn't want to use one of my two or my only free prediction to look at the likelihood of my building block manufacturers who are headquartered in Virginia, that membership renewal likelihood if I'm an association that works with toy companies, as opposed to looking at the likelihood to renew of all of my members to make sure that I'm really making the most of this free prediction that Salesforce has entitled us to use. The guided setup for this prediction builder is pretty helpful through Salesforce, but I do think that it's helpful to walk through what we're actually trying to accomplish with the prediction builder and what it's trying to do, because it makes it a little easier to help put together some of these components. So what does the prediction builder do? Broadly, I can look at records of a certain object, so a certain type of row in a data table in Salesforce. I can look at company records or accounts. I can look at contacts. I could look at sales orders or opportunities. And then I look at certain criteria to see which of two categories a particular account or a particular sales order is going to fall into. So as we go through, we're going to think about using this prediction to run membership recruitment likelihood. So I'm going to say for every account in my CRM in Salesforce, is this member going to renew or are they not going to renew? That's what this prediction is doing. And again, it is only a prediction, and the strength of our prediction is only based on the way that we build out this model. So once I've selected the object that I want to predict on, I can either decide that I'm going to predict on all of my accounts or on a segment of my accounts, or all of my opportunities or a segment of my opportunities. There's different times where both of these are going to be useful, but I think for membership renewal, I would want to look at the segment of my accounts that are currently members. So I would identify based on criteria that they were a member based on a single field that I have on the account. Or say I wanted to look at the likelihood of renewal for only my large members, I could look at different field-based criteria like revenue, right? So it depends a little bit on how we've set up looking at our membership in Salesforce, but we have different ways that we can segment. And much like other automation in Salesforce, we can segment on some pretty custom logic. So say I was a manufacturing association, I could look at lots of different criteria to build out this prediction to make sure that they were a large company that works in construction or machinery or manufacturing. Again, because we're only entitled to work on a small set of predictions at a time with the free licensing that Salesforce makes available, we might not want to get this granular. But depending on your membership model, you might have to represent this with a few different fields and play around with the prediction and the segmentation to make sure that I have identified exactly the set of members that I want to predict against to, again, run that yes or no prediction. So then I think this might be the trickiest part of the process, at least in my experience. We need to give this model some examples of yes companies and no companies, right? So what I need to be able to do is identify a small subset of my member accounts that I think are definitely going to renew, and identify a small segment of accounts that are definitely not going to renew, right? So these are individuals that renewed their membership in the past and individuals that did not renew their membership in the past. So figuring out these criteria of this good renewal and this bad non-renewal can be a little tough, because as we go through, right, I again have to look at just attributes that are on my account record. And this example that I have on screen would be a bad example of my yes outcome for reasons that we'll look at in a second. But this, I can be as simple or as complex again in how I build out my yes outcome and how I build out my no outcome. So this example would also be a bad set of criteria to build out, because when I've said that my yes example is all of my members and my no example is all of my non-members that have test in their company name, what's going to happen is as I'm building my prediction, Einstein Studio is going to run what's called a data checker against all of the records that I've included in my model. So I need to make sure that for all of these categories in my number of records that you see on the left, I've hit the required number on the right. And what is happening here is Salesforce needs to make sure that I have enough records for this to be a valid prediction. If I only had 5 accounts, there's no set of examples that I'm going to be able to generate that's going to allow me to model that. There's just not enough data for me to model with. I need to make sure that I've given then Salesforce a good set of examples that is diversely split between yes and no, so that it knows that here's a good set of folks that definitely renewed, and here's a good set of folks that definitely didn't renew. And I have to make sure that my yes and my no category are exclusive. So if I have some companies that somehow meet both of my yes and my no criteria for a member that did renew and didn't renew, the prediction also can't run. And at the end, I have to make sure that my examples didn't contain my full set of then accounts that I wanted to predict against. So trying to finesse these criteria to make sure that all of my yes examples of my members that definitely renewed all are good members that I would want to predict against. All of my no examples are bad examples that I definitely would want to predict against. They definitely haven't renewed. That those two sets don't overlap, and that I have leftovers at the end for then my prediction to run against. All of this can take some finessing to make sure that we've got our prediction firing correctly. And it can be a little tricky to figure out exactly what this set is going to look like. So this can be something that you'll need to iterate to make sure that then my data checker will run clear at the end, because I can't use my prediction until I've made sure that this data checker is all green. Otherwise, if any of these fail, I can't proceed. So there might be some back and forth and some massaging that you need to do of your segmentation, of your yes examples, and of your no examples before you can then go through and actually look at what your prediction is going to output. But say we've gone through and we've got our correct set of examples for yes and for no, and my leftover accounts that I want to predict against. It's also important to note that my predictions will only run on those records that are left over in that last category of records to predict. That means that I won't run my model against things that were in my example categories because Salesforce thinks I don't need to model for those. We already know the outcome for those. So if I want to include a very large example set and only have a few to predict against, I'm going to miss my retention calculation for any of those folks that were in that example set. So here in this instance, my examples might be too large and I might want to refine those down, even though the model will still run. But say we're running with this, we're going to predict against our 8,200 example records or non-example records that are left behind. So then what we do is we look and we figure out what fields on this object we think are likely to influence our outcome. Obviously, this is modeling, so we're not necessarily sure which of these fields are going to be the most important. In this instance, I've selected some of the stock Salesforce fields here, but just thinking about it briefly, I can imagine that some of these attributes aren't going to necessarily affect my membership retention possibility. So whether or not there is a value in the facts field of a particular account, probably not going to be important as to whether or not this company is likely to renew. But I think that industry and employees and annual revenue and perhaps any fields about location might be important. So I would want to make sure that I've unchecked all of those fields that are not likely to influence my outcome, like account owner, like site, like number, right? And I would want to make sure that I leave in every field that I think is something that might influence whether or not a member is going to renew. And that's going to vary from association to association, just depending on what your past trends have seemed like and what values you think are the most varied across your members or your potential renewing members that you think might have an impact. And this can also be massaged over time as you find that your prediction is not accurate. You can go in and reevaluate to say, maybe there are fields that it turns out I thought weren't that important, but it turns out might actually have an impact, right? I wasn't looking at industry before, but maybe I do need to include industry in my model here. Next, we need a field on this object, so on our account object, that's going to represent either our yes/no outcome, or we can run these predictions on percentage likelihood as well as that yes/no. And I want to make sure that I have that field because for all of the records that are in my prediction set, Salesforce is going to be constantly reevaluating this likelihood based on all of these attributes that might change and the way that my model overall is changing over time. Then we can look at the scorecard for this prediction once we've built it out. So what we're looking for is a score on our prediction that's in that dark green area. A prediction quality that's low might mean that our example sets are too large or too small. It might mean that our segmentation is poor, or it might mean that we haven't given the model enough variables to evaluate when it's running this analysis. An example score that is too high in that red area might represent a prediction that is not actually predicting anything. There might just be enough data that we don't need to run a prediction, and we could instead maybe calculate this with a formula. We might just be not analyzing something enough for this to be valuable. But generally, we would see those prediction scores being too low rather than being too high. And if I have that prediction score that's low, again, I can go through and I can tweak over time all of the different factors that are feeding into this prediction to try and make sure that we are evaluating something that's actionable and useful for our association. So now that we've spent some time talking about things that are Salesforce specific, I want to move into some pieces that are more general for associations, whether you're in Salesforce or not. And we'll start with large language modeling, which might be a term that you've heard and it might not be. But what we're talking about when we say LLMs or large language modeling are tools that can both understand and generate human comprehensible text. So these are your chatbot services like ChatGPT, like Microsoft Copilot. There's lots of tools that are on the market that can do this. And there's lots of features that build in this type of generative functionality into their tools. Like Salesforce Einstein has some LLM-based and LLM-powered functions like the chatbots that we looked at earlier. These tools have broad potential usage, and because of the way they're built out and the way they train their data, they also have significant possibility for inaccuracy. So the better their underlying data and the better their calculations on the back end are, the more accurate and the more valuable the outputs of these LLMs are going to be. So like I said, there's lots of LLMs that are available on the market. Although ChatGPT, I think, is the one that most folks are the most familiar with, there are tons and tons of tools available to you that will serve this purpose for you. And I think it's important to be deliberate as we are selecting these tools rather than just going with the one that we hear about first or the one that is the most cost effective. Cost is a big factor in a lot of these tools. Some of them are very expensive, but it's important to understand that if we are making an investment into some of these tools, that if we have good use cases in mind, that we can get really good ROI using some of these tools to expedite our work that we're doing in the day-to-day with our association. Another criteria is fluency of responses. So when I'm putting in text input into my chatbot of choice, some of them will return sentences that sound more natural or sound more like a human speaking, and they're more easy to understand. So tools that are highly fluent are often more usable, especially for folks that might be less technical or using these tools for a less technical implementation. Another is volume of conversations. So conversation is the term that we use for an individual thread that we might have with one of these chatbots. So messages back and forth on the same topic. And some of these tools, their licensing costs are limited based on the number of conversations that you can have in a period, whether it's a number of hours or days. So if we have individual users that are going to be interacting with these tools very highly, we might want to find one that has a higher limit in terms of volume, as opposed to something that we're only going to use occasionally. And so volume caps aren't as important for us. A big element to consider is data privacy. So when we talked about training of these AI tools, a lot of the ways that they train is by taking the inputs and outputs generated by other users of the tool and tossing them into their big training model, which is fine for lots of uses. It's okay if I ask, ChatGPT or my chatbot about general trends in an industry that I might want to report on. But if I'm putting in information, say a big sheet of all of my registrants for my annual conference, and I want to use a LLM tool to run analytics on that or to return to me certain categorizations of my data, I want to make sure that if I'm putting in personally identifying information about my members, that my usage of that tool is exempt from model training. That's the term that you're going to want to look for. And the other thing is output ownership. So I want to make sure that I know whether I own that data transformation that's been done by my LLM, or that my LLM owns that output. So it's important to understand what we're signing up for from a privacy perspective. The next one is a little difficult to identify from looking at things like privacy policy, but is a helpful tool to look at in reviews, and that is underlying bias in their data set. We'll talk a little bit about bias in just a few minutes, but if I, for example, found an LLM that was trained only on Harvard medical journals, and that was the only text input that it had, I might not get outputs that represent something that's understandable or relevant to my members who are based all around the world. So understanding where some of that training data is being sourced from can be helpful. There are also some LLM tools that have very task-specific capabilities that can do things like only generate Python code or can only generate training manuals and desk-level procedures for using a CRM database. And if you have only those niche task-specific use cases in mind, some of those tools can be really helpful. But we have found that those tools are often quite expensive. And as soon as you start to get a little more expansive with how you want to implement AI, you might have to evaluate switching to a different tool. So if you aren't sure that your use is going to be very limited, it can often be better to look at some more of these agnostic LLM tools like ChatGPT or similar chatbots. The one that we use, by the way, is called Claude. It's by a startup called Anthropic. We've tested that out pretty extensively based on some of these criteria, and it's the one that we'd recommend. One of the largest reasons that we might recommend that tool or other tools similar to it is because of customer service and company integrity. So a lot of these tools are run by startup companies, right? It's a big growing tech space. And so there's lots of small companies that have been started relatively recently. And so their customer service might not be as helpful as some other startups in the space. So looking at reviews to make sure that these companies are responsive when there are issues, whether it comes to billing, service, or outages, can be very helpful, and especially to find tools that are designed to serve smaller companies like your association rather than larger companies like some of these larger tools. So we're going to talk then a little bit about prompting large language modeling tools. And prompting is the term that we use for having a conversation with one of these chatbot tools. And although these tools seem very conversational, if I approach having an interaction with one of these tools like I'm having a conversation with someone over Instant Messenger, I might not get the outcomes that I'm looking for, and I might have a little bit more difficulty with using the tool. So these are some tips that we found helpful in terms of actually prompting or talking to these chatbots effectively. One is being clear and specific with how we interact with these tools. So rather than saying, just generate me a blog post about data governance, if I know who the blog post is going out for and why I want to communicate that information, I might want to be more direct in my prompt and say I want a blog post for an association audience that explains the importance of data governance, because otherwise I'm going to have to go back and forth with this tool to make sure that I get the outcome that I'm looking for. Another piece that can be helpful is establishing perspective for both yourself as the person who is talking to the chatbot and for the chatbot itself as it's returning responses to you. So if I want an explanation of SEO, I personally don't have a lot of understanding of SEO. And so if I ask it to explain, it might give me something that's more catered towards an industry professional who already has a broad swath of knowledge about SEO. So I might say, explain SEO to me. You are a comp sci teacher and I am an 8th grade student. That type of context setting for both myself and for the bot are going to make sure that it tools that response in something that is simple enough for the audience that I've asked it to cater to. Again, rather than giving me something that is too technical for me or for my intended audience to understand. Sometimes it can be helpful to provide some format examples. So for something like writing formulas, I can say, write me a formula to calculate this, and this is what I want my formula to look like. Or if I wanted to write me a blog post, I can say, write me a blog post, and here's an example of a blog post that I published previously. These models are really good at training on that type of input directly in that conversation, and giving that framing of that example can help it be much more in your own writerly voice or something that makes the most sense for the audience or the application that you're looking at. You also frequently will want to be quite clear with your constraints. We might know that a blog post should be 400 to 600 words based on our internal style guide at our association or just based on general conventions, right? We might know if we ask it to write us a post to go on Twitter that this is the character limit for that post, but the model might not always have that knowledge to hand when it's generating its response. So I would want to say, if it's writing me a blog post, there is a word count limit. You can also frequently ask these tools to iterate on either the entirety of the response or on specific elements of that response. So if I asked for a blog post about all of the member benefits that you can take advantage of at our upcoming annual conference, but the language in that was too complex because I'm presenting to an international audience for whom English is not everybody's first language, I might then ask that iteration of, this is too complex, can you make your response more simple? Or I might say, your third paragraph was too complex, can you simplify? And we can break that down into the entirety of the response or into specific chunks of that response that I received from that chatbot. The last piece that can be helpful is sometimes asking for explanations. If I notice something in my response from my chatbot that seems inaccurate or hasty or just not quite what I'm looking for, asking it to explain can often prompt your chatbot to either redirect because it's realized that it's provided you incorrect information, or it can give you some more clarification on why that particular response was generated so that you can gain some understanding of where that model was coming from when it put those words together to give you that response. There are certainly some pitfalls in terms of usage of LLM tools like ChatGPT. We've seen lots of them, even not in our association day-to-day, but just as we've been going through our day-to-day lives, right? Using something like Google that is prompting us with those AI summarized searches that seem inaccurate at the top of the page. Oftentimes we see these types of inaccuracies called hallucinations, where an LLM will just generate out of thin air information that's not accurate or that didn't exist in the context of your conversation. So it's important to make sure that I go through the responses that I receive from my chatbot and make sure that everything that it's brought up is relevant to the context that I provided. Frequently in the thread of a single conversation, right? So in that single exchange of back and forth messages, my LLM is training itself really actively based on that conversation that we've been having because it wants to provide the most contextually accurate responses to the conversation that we're having. But that can frequently mean that if I let my single conversation get very long, the chatbot will tend to go off the rails a little bit at one point, and then it will continue to go further and further off the rails because it's understood that we're continuing this conversation based on this weird piece of data that it introduced. So sometimes if you notice that your chatbot of choice becomes less comprehensible or starts talking about things in detail that really aren't relevant, it can be helpful to basically turn it off and turn it back on again to close out that conversation and to start another, providing some of the context from our previous conversation, but leaving it out of that previous poorly trained thread. We can also see some biased responses in our chatbots and in all of our AI tools. We'll talk about that in just a moment. So it can be important to then maybe ask for a reprompt that asks to factor in things that might be more relevant to, for example, our members all over the world, as opposed to only our members that are in the US. Another piece that can be challenging is I mentioned providing specific constraints in the responses that we're looking for from these types of tools. And sometimes our responses just won't follow those constraints, right? So I'll ask for that blog post to be between 400 and 600 words. And when I input it into a word count tool, it's 900 words. So when in doubt, it's always important to verify the information in the outputs that are provided to you, not only by LLMs, but by all AI tools that we might be thinking to implement. So we talked a little bit about bias as we were looking at kind of tool selection for LLMs, but we can find bias being introduced in all sorts of AI implementations. And much like humans who are looking at large sets of data and trying to do analysis can become biased, AI also becomes biased based on the constraints in the data that we provide to it. But we often find that AI is even better at becoming biased than other forms of tools because it doesn't have that sort of human oversight to think critically about the data that it's reviewing. So there are many types of bias that we can see, but a few that I think are the most relevant are measurement bias. So if I oversimplify the data that I've provided, say in my prediction builder, right, I wanted to look at my yes and no examples for members that are likely to renew. If I only provided yes examples of members that did renew that are in Canada, and all of my no examples for members that didn't renew are in Florida, if I then feed it other members that are in Canada or Florida, it might think that that geographic attribute is the most important and assume that all of my Canadian members will renew and all of my Florida members won't, which is just likely to not be accurate based on the association's needs across the world. We also find that there can be association bias introduced, funnily enough, where we might label our data that we provide based on stereotypes. So say I am an association of toy manufacturers, and I'm looking at different types of manufacturing products that my members might produce. If I categorize toys based on gender usage, right, all of these Barbie doll toys, I'm going to say, are always for girls, and all of these construction toys are always for boys. It might then use that stereotype to make influencing decisions based on the data that I provide that I as a human might not want to introduce in how I was looking at that data. We might also see something called automation bias, which is an outcome of using AI. So I might run modeling based on the likelihood of finding board candidates in a certain area. I'm looking for a new chairman of my board. And I might only provide it good examples of people that might be potential board candidates who are in DC. And then when I'm looking to do my board search, I'm only going to contact candidates that are in DC because I accidentally told my model that that was the only place that I could find good candidates. I didn't think critically about the data that I provided to that model, and I just acted on it. All of these and many more are different sources of bias that we can see in our AI usage. But all of these come down to the fact that if I provide bad training data to my model, I'm going to find badly modeled outcomes that don't broadly represent the interests of all of the members that I'm looking to serve or the different team members that we might have at our association. So how do we mitigate these ethical concerns? And there are, lots of different sources of ethical concerns that we might see as we're implementing AI tools. So one of the easiest is to avoid training on biased data sets. So we've talked a lot about different ways that we can broaden our data sets to be more representative of the population that we're trying to serve. But we also might want to avoid modeling based on biasing individual attributes. So say I am an association that serves educators. We find often that geographic location has a lot of impact on education outcomes because of socioeconomic factors in those areas. So if I'm trying to look at the quality of education for individual students, unless geography is a really important part of that model, including zip code might be something that introduces unneeded bias into my modeling of learning outcomes for those students. Because of this, we also want to make sure that we're including diverse perspectives, both as we collect our data and also as we model it. So if I want to look at modeling for my members, and I'm a global association, I want to make sure that my models capture members from all over the globe. And I also want to make sure that the models that I'm building on are built to serve all of the employees of my association. So if I'm looking at revenue forecasting, I'm not just looking at membership modeling, I'm also looking at modeling for events revenue, for sponsorship revenue, for things that touch across our association. It's important to make sure that humans can intervene and review data before it goes into that model and pull out outliers or things that would introduce unnecessary bias. And that we always make sure that when we have any sort of output from any AI tool, whether it is a predictive model or a generation of chat outcome or images or anything like that, that we review them to make sure that they're accurate, true, and well produced before we publish them, especially to our members. There's two other small pieces that I'll touch on quickly. One is avoiding tools, or at least considering our use of tools that rely on intellectual property theft. This is a hot conversation in the industry and outside of it. And if I spent too much time talking about it, that would have been the entire hour and more. But a lot of especially image generation tools are often built on a training library of images that have been taken illegally from artists or producers of images. So it's important to evaluate where some of our data sets are coming from, especially for generative tools, and disclosing the use of those generative tools publicly rather than trying to hide that, for example, we used an image generation tool to create promotional materials because the pushback from that publicly can be quite negative. We also want to make sure that our data is surely protected, especially if we're feeding our members' data into these data points into these tools. We talked a little bit about making sure when we have an LLM tool that we're implementing that our data is securely protected and exempt from training models, and that we own the output of those tools. That is true not just for LLMs, but for all of the AI tools that we might choose to implement in our stack. So the last thing that I want to talk about a little bit is what artificial intelligence is not, because we've talked about some specific use cases for associations, but there are a countless number of tools that we could choose to implement for lots of different use cases. And I want to make sure that we have an understanding that choosing an AI tool is not choosing a new staff member on our team. We're not choosing something that can replace the human intelligence of the staff members that we have or the members that we might choose to consult. An AI tool is not something that we can turn on and let act independently without any sort of human review. And like I mentioned, it's not a good way to teach yourself new information, because if I don't know an area of knowledge, I have no way of verifying that the outputs that were provided to me from my AI tool are true. Because at the end of the day, I can't necessarily trust 100% any output that has been created by any of these AI tools, whether it's because I modeled poorly, the data set that it was referencing is poor, or whether it's because I asked the wrong question, or I asked my question in the wrong way. So that might have sounded kind of negative, and it might have sounded like a lot of my indicators here were that there's lots of places where people would think to use AI that I think they shouldn't. And that's certainly not the case. Obviously, I think AI is a really valuable tool that you can introduce into your tech stack. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that for repeatable tasks or for some of these predictive models, using AI tools can save, especially our small teams, a lot of time. And for a lot of folks at associations who have to take on multiple job responsibilities and have to make sure that everything gets done with a team that's really lean, using an AI as a companion to the work that you're already doing can make sure that you can take on and take off those multiple hats and fill those multiple job roles as effectively as possible. And especially, I find that using that AI tool to do these tasks that I technically could do myself, but I need to do more quickly, or I technically could model myself, but I want to do more broadly and effectively. Using these AI tools allows me to make sure that for myself and for my team, we are saving our human brain power for tasks that only humans can accomplish that require more strategic or critical thinking, and can really make sure that for those of us who are on the team, we are using our time to the best of our ability while still making sure that we can get done really high quality work to serve our members and to serve our community. So with that, I'll open up the floor for questions.
Thank you so much, Arden. I continue to learn from you, so I appreciate it. We do have a couple questions that have come in, and just as a reminder to anyone watching, if you want to add a question, there's a Q&A icon at the bottom of your panel, but let's get started. Okay, Arden, can you share some successful examples of your own usage of AI?
Sure. So first of all, filling in some of the examples in this presentation, I used AI tools to help me generate that. Because when it comes to putting together example prompts or putting together, again, bodies of text for things that I already know the answer to, it was a way to quickly fill out those sections of this exact presentation so that I could focus on building out some of the broader content and examples. We've also had great success with taking transcripts of meetings, especially using Zoom's really nifty AI companion tool that will smartly summarize what's been discussed in a meeting. So you can generate using that AI companion. You can have that brown bag session we found a lot internally, and then take the outputs of that transcript and generate it into a blog post that can be published or shared broadly. So we found that those tools are really helpful. And I've also found it helpful for at least architecting the broad outlines of complex flows in Salesforce. That's an area of my job that I'm comfortable doing. But when it comes to at least sketching out that outline, I can use these large language modeling elements. Like I said, we were originally using ChatGPT. We've switched to Claude. And even if I can't use that type of tool or something like Einstein for flow to build a flow that I can put into production and immediately turn on, it saves me that initial ideating. I know what business requirements I want to accomplish, and then I can feed those in and have my output move much faster than if I had to generate it on my own.
Super, thank you. I too enjoyed the AI companion summary that comes
Yeah,
in.
it's nice to not have to have someone whose entire job on a meeting is taking notes, and to
Absolutely.
instead have something that is, again, just going to be taking notes for you that you can then review after the fact.
Yep, I love it. Thank you. Let's see. Does Einstein predictive modeling provide reasoning for outcomes? For instance, in your example of bad outcome, would it tell you the results were because people in Florida are not likely to renew while people in Canada are likely?
In my experience with the prediction builder, it might not give you that level of drill down into why it thinks your predictions are poor quality. But because we have that prediction on every record, right, on a per account level, I could see that this member was predicted as a not likely to renew and this member was. I could then take that out and then try and do some initial picking of, say, I was predicting based on 7 attributes. I could try to categorize and see which of those attributes in my output were maybe less helpful than others, or it was maybe focusing on incorrectly.
Super, thank you. Let's see. For a small association team, what type of tool do you think would be the most useful or maybe the most effective place to start exploring AI?
Sure. So I think something along the lines of either a Microsoft Copilot, that's something that has some kind of broad implementation across everything that you're doing, or a standalone chatbot tool, again, like ChatGPT or Claude. These are the kind of jack of all trades you could think of AI tools that are relevant for a lot of different things. They might not be the best at a lot of those jobs, but they can certainly get you started with a lot of those tasks and start giving you some familiarity and some comfort with how those tools work and what types of outputs they produce. I think especially something like these generative text tools, the Zoom AI companion actually is also an LLM in the background, right? It's taking in the text of that meeting transcript and it's providing an output. I think sometimes these tools are also helpful when there is some discomfort or some misunderstanding about what these tools are supposed to do. Something that is relatively simple that plugs in well to work that we're already doing as an association can make it easier for us to feel like we have some confidence of what those tools do and what they don't do, so that we all as a group understand what we're signing up for before we then start looking into something that, for example, does larger data modeling and analysis. The other reason why I might lean towards some of these jack of all trades tools is especially some of these data analytics tools that can get quite expensive. So if we're not comfortable as a group with our AI usage and our plan and the security of that plan, it can be easier to opt for these things that have relatively low licensing costs and have monthly contracts as opposed to annual, so that we can test the waters, see if there's someone who's excited to champion that cause internally, and then look into some of these more expensive tools that might allow us to do things that are even more robust than something like Claude or Zoom.
Certainly. My dad's favorite phrase was crawl, walk, run. So it sounds like
Exactly.
you might be suggesting the same. Okay. I loved your guidance on how AI can be leveraged. When having conversation, I get the impression that a misconception is, this is in quotes, AI will help me do things I don't have the skills to do. It is important to know that someone has to be in charge of your AI. They should be able to execute these types of tasks. This is not a question, this is a statement, and I think it's great. AI is a tool to help us be more effective and an assistant assistance with executing tasks that can be cumbersome to complete without it. I think
Yeah.
that harkens back to when you said it is a tool in your tech stack.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially when it comes to how we communicate with our internal teams that we're looking to use these kind of tools, there is this general cultural discomfort, much like the what we all hear about the Industrial Revolution, where people were convinced that automated tools were going to fully take jobs from the hands of the worker. I think there is a lot of that discomfort with AI too. And I think it's important to be compassionate and deliberate with how we communicate with our staff when it comes to using these tools, right? If I was to tell my developers that we were implementing an automated deployment tool, the way that I would communicate to them wouldn't indicate that I was going to use that automated deployment tool to outsource them out of a job to something like GearSet. But I can understand very much the reticence when people feel like the tools that we're trying to implement might impact their job longevity. So communicating it to our team as this is a tool that can help you do your job that you will continue to have. And here's how it can help you do your job better and solve more interesting problems than taking time to do some of these cumbersome tasks, I think can really help assuage that fear and that discomfort when it comes to setting up some of these tools. So that's a great mindset to have and to make sure that we carry that through with our kind of rollout plan and how we talk to our teams.
Sure. It all comes down to remembering that we're all dealing with humans, right?
Right. That we are all humans and we want to talk to humans the way that they want to be talked to, even if we're encouraging them to then talk to the computer rather than talking to us about how to solve their problems.
Yeah, certainly. I think we have time for one more question. Let's see. Are there any sorts of resources you'd recommend for further AI education?
Yeah, absolutely. So I completed the AI associate certification through Salesforce, which is not something that's limited to only Salesforce customers, and actually focused, I would say, almost entirely on some of these broader industry questions about types of AI tools and how to implement them ethically and securely. So that's definitely, there are some education materials that you can pursue there. And then the other thing that I would recommend is a lot of, especially tools like Claude and ChatGPT, some of these chatbots, they do have free accounts available. I wouldn't recommend using those free accounts as part of your enterprise tech platform because they don't let you opt out of some of these security measures to take your data and put it into training. So I wouldn't necessarily use it for actually interacting with my clients' data or at an association with my members' data, but they can be really helpful to just play around and see what you can create in some of these tools. Because AI is this massive growth industry, it feels like every single person is talking about it when almost nobody knew the term before, 2018, 2019. There is always something new that you can do and something new that you can learn. And I think when we're implementing some of these tools, it's important to be experimental, right? To understand that we could always discover either new use cases that are really effective, or we could test something out and find that it really doesn't work for us. So I would, again, recommend those Salesforce trails. We can certainly send those out if that would be helpful to folks. But also, I would recommend finding free tools that might be available and testing them out, as long as we're testing them out securely and not inputting data into them that we would be uncomfortable being shared or trained on more broadly.
Yeah, super. Okay, well, I think with that, we have just 2 minutes left, so I will excuse all of you. Thank you for your time. If you have any further questions about AI, would like to talk about perhaps AI with nonprofit use cases, please reach out to us. We're at Fíonta.com. Thank you so much. Thank you, Arden. Appreciate it.